The rain always started before dawn in the city, as if the sky itself knew who had to wake up early and fight for another day, and every morning before the rich families opened their curtains, before the expensive coffee machines hummed, before the marble floors reflected the golden lights of luxury, she was already standing at the bus stop with tired eyes and cold hands, holding a small worn-out bag against her chest like it carried the last pieces of her hope. Her name was Elena, and nobody in those giant houses ever asked her story, because people who are surrounded by comfort rarely notice the silent wars of those who clean around them. She came to the city with nothing except a photograph of her mother and a dream too impossible for someone like her to even whisper out loud, because dreams are dangerous when poverty follows you everywhere, and her dream was law. She wanted to become a lawyer, not for fame, not for money, but because she had spent her whole childhood watching innocent people lose everything simply because they were too poor to defend themselves. She remembered her father, standing in court, unable to speak, unable to understand the words that destroyed his life, while rich men in expensive suits smiled without emotion, and from that moment a fire started inside her that never died even when life tried to drown it. During the day, she cleaned mansions where chandeliers cost more than her entire childhood home. She scrubbed bathrooms larger than the tiny apartment she rented. She folded silk sheets for people who complained about being tired, while she survived on 4 hours of sleep and cheap instant noodles. But every night, when the city lights faded and exhaustion wrapped around her shoulders, she opened her law books in silence and studied until sunrise. Her fingers cracked from chemicals her back burned with pain, her eyes turned red from sleepless nights, but she never stopped, because some dreams become the only reason a person survives. Nobody knew. Not the rich woman who shouted at her because a wine glass had fingerprints on it. Not the businessman who walked past her like she was invisible. Not the spoiled teenagers who laughed while leaving dirty clothes scattered across the floor. To them, she was just the maid. Just another invisible woman cleaning the world while the world ignored her existence. But hidden inside that exhausted body was a mind sharper than anyone could imagine. Every spare minute became a classroom. She listened to recorded lectures through cheap earphones while riding buses. She memorized legal definitions while washing dishes. She highlighted textbooks during lunch breaks while sitting alone on staircases because restaurants were too expensive. And sometimes, when nobody was home, she paused for a moment inside those giant libraries rich families decorated for appearance and stared at the law books, sitting untouched on polished shelves, wondering how unfair life could be that knowledge was displayed like decoration in homes where nobody needed it, while people like her had to sacrifice everything just to touch it. One winter night, the temperature dropped so low that her hands shook while cleaning windows on the 3rd floor of a mansion overlooking the city. She had already worked 14 hours, and her body felt close to collapsing when she accidentally knocked over an expensive crystal vase. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot, and for one frozen second her heart stopped. The owner of the house stormed into the room, furious, his face red with anger, his voice sharp enough to cut through her soul. He screamed that the vase was worth more than a year of her salary. He called her careless, useless, pathetic, and Elena stood there trembling, apologizing over and over while silently calculating how many extra shifts she would need to survive after this disaster. Then something unexpected happened. A young man entered the room. Tall, calm, wearing a dark suit and carrying files under his arm. He looked at the broken glass, then looked at Elena, and for the first time in years someone truly looked at her, not through her, not above her, but at her. He quietly told the owner it was only an object and accidents happen. The rich man scoffed and walked away, muttering insults under his breath. Elena quickly knelt down, trying to clean the broken pieces before tears escaped her eyes. The young man crouched beside her and noticed the law textbook partially visible inside her bag. For a second he seemed confused. Then he asked softly, "You study law?" Her breath caught. Embarrassment flooded her face because she suddenly felt foolish, as if her dreams sounded ridiculous spoken out loud in a room like this. She nodded slowly, waiting for him to laugh. But he did not laugh. Instead, his eyes changed with something she had almost forgotten existed: respect. His name was Daniel, and he was a lawyer working for one of the biggest firms in the city. He asked her questions gently, not like someone mocking her, but like someone genuinely curious. And for the first time, Elena spoke about her dream. Without fear, she told him how she studied at night, how she saved every coin for tuition, how she cleaned houses to survive, and Daniel listened in complete silence. Before leaving, he looked at her and said something she would remember forever. The world notices titles before struggle, but struggle creates people stronger than titles ever could. That night, Elena cried alone in her apartment because after years of being invisible, someone had finally seen her. Days passed and life remained cruel. Bills piled higher. Her landlord threatened eviction. Her body weakened from exhaustion. Sometimes she fell asleep on open textbooks and woke up terrified because another exam waited ahead. There were moments she wanted to quit, moments when hopelessness whispered that poor girls do not become lawyers, they become forgotten. But then she remembered her father. She remembered every humiliation, every rich person who looked through her like she was nothing. And she kept going. Months later, she received news that nearly destroyed her. Her mother back in her hometown became seriously ill. Hospital costs were impossible. Elena stared at the numbers, feeling the ground disappear beneath her, because every cent she saved for law school suddenly belonged to survival. That week she worked 3 jobs, sleeping barely 2 hours a night, cleaning offices during evenings, houses during mornings, and restaurants after midnight, until her legs shook from exhaustion. One night, while cleaning a law office after hours, she noticed legal papers left open across a conference table. Curiosity pulled her eyes toward the case, and she realized it involved tenants being illegally forced out of their homes by a wealthy corporation. Something inside her burned, because she understood those people. She understood fear of losing shelter. She understood powerlessness. And without thinking, she started reading every page, memorizing details, absorbing arguments, analyzing loopholes the way only someone hungry for justice could. A senior lawyer unexpectedly entered the room, catching her standing beside confidential files. Panic exploded through her chest. She expected to be fired immediately. But instead, the lawyer questioned her about the case, almost mockingly, expecting silence. What happened next stunned him. Elena answered every question correctly. Then she pointed out weaknesses in the corporation's argument, flaws even junior associates had missed. The lawyer stared at her in disbelief. "Who taught you this?" She whispered quietly. "Nobody. I study alone." That moment changed everything. Word slowly spread through the office about the cleaning lady who understood law better than interns from elite universities, and some laughed, refusing to believe it, while others grew curious. But Elena ignored all of them because survival still demanded more than admiration. Weeks later, Daniel returned and offered her something unbelievable. An internship. Small, unpaid, difficult, but real. Elena almost refused because unpaid opportunities belong to people who can afford hope, but Daniel convinced the firm to let her work evenings while still cleaning during mornings. So her impossible life became even harder. She spent days cleaning houses and nights preparing legal documents. Coffee replaced sleep. Stress replaced peace. But slowly, people inside the firm began noticing her intelligence, her determination, her ability to understand human pain not as theory, but as lived reality. Clients trusted her because when they spoke about fear, she truly understood fear. When they cried about injustice, she understood injustice. And unlike many lawyers who memorized laws from textbooks, Elena had memorized suffering from life itself. Years passed. The exhausted maid slowly transformed into a woman impossible to ignore. She graduated near the top of her class, wearing a simple borrowed dress, while others arrived with wealthy families and expensive celebrations. But when her name echoed across the auditorium, she looked toward the ceiling, fighting tears, because she wished her father could see her now. Soon after graduation, she faced the courtroom for the first time, standing against a powerful real estate company accused of forcing poor families from their homes. The courtroom felt cold, massive, intimidating. The opposing lawyers wore confidence like armor. Some recognized her from years earlier. Whispers spread quietly. "Is that the maid? The cleaning girl?" Elena heard every word, but she no longer carried shame. Because struggle had built something stronger inside her than their judgment could destroy. When she stood to speak, silence filled the courtroom. And then her voice rose, calm, emotional, powerful, carrying every sleepless night, every humiliation, every wound she survived. She spoke not only about laws but about dignity, about mothers terrified of homelessness, about children sleeping in cars while corporations chased profit. She spoke with the pain of someone who knew what it meant to be powerless, and the courtroom listened. Even the judge leaned forward. Hours later, the verdict arrived. The families won. Tears exploded across the room, people hugged each other, crying with relief, while Elena stood frozen, overwhelmed, because in that moment, she realized the dream that once felt impossible had finally become real. News spread quickly across the city. The former house cleaner turned lawyer became a symbol of resilience. Interviews followed, newspapers printed her story, strangers wrote letters thanking her for giving them hope, but fame never changed her, because she remembered exactly where she came from. One evening years later, Elena walked past the same mansion where she once cleaned floors, and the rich owner who insulted her recognized her, instantly, shock covering his face as he saw cameras following behind her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, quietly, awkwardly, he apologized. Elena looked at him with calm eyes, no anger, no revenge, only peace, because life had already answered everything that needed answering. She simply smiled gently and walked away. That night she returned to her small apartment, though now she could afford luxury, because the apartment reminded her of who she used to be. She sat beside the window watching rain fall across the city, remembering the frightened, exhausted girl who once studied law books after cleaning strangers' bathrooms. And she whispered softly to herself, "You survived." Somewhere across the city, another tired young woman was probably cleaning offices, believing her dreams were impossible, believing the world would never notice her struggle. But stories like Elena's matter because they remind people that greatness is not born from comfort. Sometimes greatness is born in silence, in exhaustion, in hidden sacrifices nobody applauds. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones society overlooks every single day. And somewhere between broken sleep and impossible hope, a maid became a lawyer and proved that dreams do not belong only to the rich. They belong to anyone brave enough to suffer for them until the world finally has no choice but to see them.